Biological Code Podcast, a podcast on Germanische Heilkunde. Today we're talking about muscle pain and mein Studentenmädchen. Carlos is 58 years old and right-handed. He and his partner Camina have been passionate dancers for many years, and still they continue to share their love of dancing. This story goes back to a time when Carlos was around 50, when he experienced a very intense collapse in his self-esteem. In Germanische Heilkunde we call this a self-devaluation conflict. Here is how it happened. Carlos and Camina danced often, at many different schools and venues. When they first met, although Camina was 11 years younger than Carlos, she already had 30 years of dance experience. Carlos, on the other hand, was only a beginner, especially with certain dances. Camina, often in collaboration with dance instructors, taught Carlos many dances, including the samba. He practiced diligently, both at dance school and at home on their little dance floor. Yet despite all this practice, Carlos had an inner resistance to the samba, and on a particular day nothing seemed to work. To make things worse, the dance teacher that day made a thoughtless comment toward him, which he didn't expect. And Camina, trying to help, said something like, "You need to move your hips more." Exhausted after a long night shift, Carlos felt like a failure in front of both his teacher and his partner. And so in that moment he experienced a biological conflict, more specifically a self-devaluation conflict. As we already know, the biological conflict needs to consist of the following three criteria. A. Highly acute traumatic. Carlos felt incapable and exposed in front of his partner and others. B. Unexpected. He was caught off guard by the teacher's comment and Camina's correction. And C. Perceived in isolation. He felt utterly alone with his feeling of being a failure at samba. And on this day, it hit him really hard. As a man, he naturally wanted to keep up and impress Camina. But as he was so tired, he felt incapable of remembering his steps. He perceived this as a self-devaluation conflict, related to dancing and affecting all his muscles related to the dance movements, with muscle atrophy. Initially, he didn't notice any physical changes because muscle atrophy is painless and only becomes evident over time. Usually, he would let comments like these slide. No big deal. Dancing with his dear Camina was much more important than getting upset over little comments, but this time it caught him off guard. The tiredness, not keeping up, failing to remember his steps, it hit him on a biological level, surpassing his rational mind. From now on, Carlos was conflict active. He had compulsive thinking about not being able to perform while dancing. It played on his mind and he simply couldn't find any peace. Of course he continued to dance the routines again and again, but he found himself in an unusual situation where the samba steps just weren't easy for him as the other dances. Firstly, he struggled with the samba, then also with the slow fox, and finally with the salsa. About 6 to 9 months had passed before Carlos made a decision and talked to Camina about it. "Listen, this isn't working for me anymore, and I don't want to dance these dances anymore." Camina agreed because the joy of dancing was the most important thing to her too. She had certainly noticed that her dance partner simply couldn't find any joy in these particular dances. Gradually, after a few more lessons, Carlos realized he could skip these dances without issue, and gradually his self-esteem was rebuilt, and the resolution to the conflict came. Then, 3 to 4 weeks after the conversation with Camina, the healing began, with pain in his feet. In Germanische Heilkunde, we know that the striated muscles have two brain relays, one in the cerebral medulla, which controls the trophic function, the other in the motor cortex, which controls the muscle movement. If an individual experiences a self-devaluation conflict, both relays are impacted, which then initiates functional impairment and muscle atrophy in the relevant muscle. When the musculature is affected, we always have a combination of self-worth collapse and playing dead reflex. The distribution can vary greatly. In Carlos's case, the self-worth collapse dominated. This leads to muscle necrosis or muscle atrophy and thus to weakening of the musculature. The playing dead reflex leads to paralysis, which doesn't necessarily have to be noticeable if only a few muscle fibers are affected. The remaining musculature can compensate for the paralysis in this case. Beside him not enjoying these specific dances anymore, Carlos hadn't noticed any physical changes. The tissue adaptation process was completely unnoticeable for him. Also, he didn't realize that making the decision to avoid those specific dances would bring the needed resolution. He resolved his conflict in this way, instinctively. Only now, as the pain in his feet began, did he become aware that he had resolved a self-devaluation conflict, but he didn't yet know what it was related to. Interestingly, he didn't experience the pain only on his right partner side, as one might expect, but on both sides of his body, right and left. This shows us that he must have experienced this conflict locally, and the statement, "I felt like a failure at dancing," describes his perception very well. If he had experienced a self-devaluation conflict only in relation to his partner or the dance teacher, he would have had the pain only on his partner side. As he continued to dance and gain trust in his ability to perform the steps well again, the healing phase also began to unfold in stages. Within about 4 weeks, first his feet began to hurt, then his calves, then his thighs, and finally also his hips. The calf cramps and restless legs that he experienced are small epileptic crises in the striated muscles, indicating the resolution of a motor conflict. Only when the pain reached his hip did it click for Carlos, and he became aware that his conflict was the samba incident. Carlos had very severe muscle pain. He remembered that Dr. Hamer not only discovered the 5 biological laws of nature, but also that which he called the second leg of Germanische Heilkunde, which is Mein Studentenmädchen, the magic melody and little love song of Dr. Hamer. Therefore, when he was at home, he played it quietly in the background continually, ensuring the song's effect. The pain in his lower body slowly subsided and soon disappeared completely. But soon after, his shoulders and hands began to hurt. He had calculated that the time period from his biological conflict to the conflict resolution must have been about 6 to 9 months, and he could still remember everything very well. He now decided to also take the song with him to work on a small listening device. This way, he ensured he could listen to it all around the clock, every day. It wasn't long after that all his pain subsided. Learn to think biologically. The knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde belongs in every household. If you'd like to learn how to apply the 5 biological laws in everyday life, visit thebiologyproject.org. You can also find more about our association at urkraftleben.at. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Telegram, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. Until next time.